A truck driver parks his rig on the shoulder of a frozen highway in northern Manitoba. It is 2 in the morning, minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit, and the wind is cutting through the dark hard enough to freeze exposed skin in under 10 minutes. His sleeper cab, the 70-square-foot metal box behind the driver's seat that he calls home 300 nights a year, is the only thing between him and that cold. By morning, the inside of that cab should be a freezer. But 8 hours later, he wakes up warm enough to kick off a blanket, starts his engine, and pulls back onto the highway like nothing happened. The gap between a comfortable night and a fatal one comes down to a system most people have never thought about. And some of the solutions are brilliant. How does someone who lives full-time in a metal and glass box on wheels turn that box into a heated apartment at minus 30? It starts with understanding what you are actually fighting against. A truck cab is not a house. That difference matters more than you might think. A house has thick, insulated walls, a concrete foundation, and multiple layers of material between you and the outside air. A truck cab is a metal shell with a lot of glass. That windshield alone is a massive surface area that radiates cold directly into the interior, almost like leaving a window cracked in slow motion. Cold air hunts for every gap it can find, every imperfect door seal, every dashboard vent that does not close all the way, every spot where rubber meets metal around a window frame and the fit is not quite perfect. Without a running heat source, the temperature inside drops fast. Within 2 to 3 hours of shutting the engine off on a minus 30 night, the interior of a truck cab can fall below freezing. Give it 4 to 6 hours, and the temperature inside that metal box can reach levels where hypothermia becomes a real risk for anyone without backup heating. For a driver whose truck is his only home, who cannot just walk inside a warm house, that timeline is everything. And there is a problem that catches every rookie driver off guard during their first real winter on the road: condensation. A human being exhales warm, moist air all night long. In a warm house with good ventilation, that moisture disappears into the air. In a freezing truck cab, it heads straight to the coldest surfaces, the windows. As the cab temperature drops, that moisture does not just fog up the glass. It freezes directly onto the inside of the windows. By morning, every window is coated in a solid sheet of frost on both sides, inside and outside. The cab feels like a walk-in freezer with frosted glass walls, and visibility is completely gone until you scrape every pane by hand. And that is just the cold. For a driver who lives in his truck full-time, who cooks his meals in a microwave bolted to the wall, watches a small television mounted above the bunk, and keeps his entire wardrobe in a cabinet the size of a carry-on suitcase, this is not a temporary inconvenience. This is his home, night after night, week after week, for months of winter. The truck is not just where he works, it is where he lives. And keeping that home warm enough to sleep in is not a comfort question, it is a survival question. Pay attention to this next part, because it explains why these trucks are built the way they are. Modern long-haul sleeper cabs, the kind rolling off the lines at Volvo in Gothenburg, Scania in Södertälje, Kenworth in Chillicothe, Peterbilt in Denton, and Freightliner in Portland, are engineered with extreme cold in mind. The insulation inside a modern sleeper compartment has come a long way from what trucks had 20 or even 15 years ago. The walls, floor, and ceiling of the sleeper section contain multiple layers of thermal insulation material, similar in concept to what you would find inside a well-built house wall, but compressed into a much thinner profile. It is not going to keep a cab warm all night by itself, but it slows the loss of heat enough to give the heating systems a fighting chance. The windows on modern trucks are double glazed, which cuts heat loss through the glass significantly compared to the single pane glass that was standard through the 90s. Some Scandinavian models, particularly from Volvo and Scania, take this even further with triple-seal window assemblies, because when your manufacturer is based in Sweden, cold weather performance is not an afterthought, it is a selling point, and the door seals deserve more credit than they usually get. A poor door seal on a truck at minus 30 is not just uncomfortable, it can turn a livable cab into a dangerous one overnight. Manufacturers now use multi-layer rubber sealing systems that compress tightly when the door shuts, creating an almost airtight barrier against cold air. The difference between a well-maintained seal and a worn-out one at -30 can be the difference between sleeping comfortably and waking up shivering at 4 in the morning, wondering what went wrong. Now, there is a design detail here that most people walk right past without thinking about, and it explains a lot. The bunk itself, the actual sleeping area where the driver lays down at night, is positioned at the rear of the cab. That is not random layout. That placement is deliberate engineering. The rear of the cab is the most thermally protected zone of the entire vehicle. It is the farthest point from the doors, the farthest point from the massive cold radiating windshield, and it is surrounded on more sides by insulated walls than any other spot in the cabin. The driver sleeping in that bunk is sitting in the warmest possible location by design. But insulation only buys you time. Think of it like a cooler keeping ice from melting. The cooler does not create cold. It just slows the loss. At -30, the best insulation in the world will eventually lose the fight without actual heat being fed into the system. And for someone who lives in a 70 square foot sleeper cab 300 nights a year, eventually is not good enough. So the trucking industry developed heating solutions. And some of them are more clever than you would expect. The most obvious heat source is the truck's own diesel engine. When a big diesel engine is running, it produces enormous amounts of waste heat. The cabin heating system takes advantage of that by circulating hot engine coolant through a heater core mounted inside the cab. A blower fan pushes air over the heater core, and the interior warms up fast. A running diesel engine can take a full-size sleeper cab from freezing to comfortable in just a few minutes. That is impressive when you think about how much air you are heating inside a space with thin metal walls and a lot of glass working against you. So why not just leave the engine running all night? 2 reasons: cost and the law. A truck diesel engine burning fuel at idle consumes roughly 2 to 4 liters per hour, depending on the truck and the outside conditions. For a full-time driver who parks for the night every night across an entire winter season, that fuel cost adds up to thousands of dollars. Fuel burned without moving the truck a single mile down the road. For an owner-operator paying for his own diesel, that is money straight out of his pocket. For a fleet, multiply that by hundreds of trucks and the number becomes staggering. And in many parts of North America, it is not even legal anymore. Multiple states and Canadian provinces have anti-idling regulations that limit how long a truck engine can run while the vehicle is stationary. Sometimes the limit is as little as 3 to 5 minutes. Those laws exist for emissions and noise pollution reasons, but they created a practical problem the industry had to solve. How do you keep a driver warm all night without burning 3 liters of diesel an hour through the main engine? But here is the part that a lot of people outside the trucking world never heard about. The solutions that the industry developed turned out to be far more efficient than engine idling ever was. And they come in 2 forms. The first solution you will find on a lot of North American long-haul trucks is the auxiliary power unit, usually just called an APU. If you have ever walked past a row of parked semi-trucks at a rest stop or a truck stop parking lot and noticed a small separate unit bolted near the back of the cab or tucked underneath the frame rails, that is probably what you were looking at. An APU is a small independent diesel engine, much smaller than the truck's main engine, built specifically to provide heat, air conditioning, and electrical power to the sleeper cab while the main engine stays completely off. Think of it as a dedicated generator for the living space. A typical APU puts out somewhere around 5 to 15 kilowatts of power, which is more than enough to run the cabin heater at full blast, keep a small refrigerator cold, charge a phone and a laptop, power a microwave for heating up a meal, and keep the driver comfortable through an entire 8-hour night at -30. The fuel savings compared to idling the main engine are where these units earn their keep. Where the main engine burns 3 or 4 liters per hour at idle, an APU might burn as little as 1 liter per hour, sometimes less. Over a full winter season for a driver who parks most nights, that difference saves thousands of dollars in diesel, enough to pay off the cost of the APU itself within a year or 2. Which is exactly why so many trucking fleets and independent owner-operators invest in them despite the upfront price tag. The downside is straightforward. An APU is one more mechanical system bolted onto the truck. One more thing that needs maintenance, one more thing with parts that wear out, and one more thing that can break down at the worst possible moment. And APU failures have an almost supernatural talent for timing. Ask any long-haul driver who has spent more than a few winters on the road, and they will have at least one story about their APU dying at -30 on a dark highway shoulder somewhere in northern Ontario or central Saskatchewan, 200 kilometers from the nearest service shop, with nothing to do but bundle up and wait for morning. It is practically a rite of passage. But the fact that drivers treat it as a story and not a tragedy tells you something about how prepared they usually are. Most APU-equipped drivers develop a routine around the unit. They start it up about 30 minutes before they plan to sleep, let it get the cab to a comfortable temperature, set the thermostat, and climb into the bunk knowing the APU will cycle on and off through the night to maintain temperature. Some units even have remote controls that let the driver adjust the heat from the bunk without getting up. For a driver who lives in his truck year-round, the APU is not just heating equipment. It is the difference between a truck and a home. There is a second solution, though, that deserves even more attention. And in terms of efficiency, it might be the most elegant piece of engineering in the entire trucking industry: the diesel parking heater. The two brands you will hear about more than any others are Webasto and Espar. Espar is sometimes listed under the full company name Eberspacher, which almost nobody uses in conversation. A diesel parking heater is a small, self-contained combustion unit roughly the size of a shoebox installed somewhere inside the truck, usually under the cab or tucked into a compartment in the sleeper area. It pulls a small amount of diesel directly from the truck's main fuel tank, burns it in a tightly controlled combustion chamber, and uses the heat produced to either warm the engine coolant through the existing heater core inside the cab or blow heated air directly into the living space, depending on the model. The fuel consumption numbers are where these units become hard to argue with. A Webasto or Espar heater running through an entire -30 night might consume as little as 0.2 to 0.5 liters of diesel per hour. That is not a typo, by the way. Compare that to 2 to 4 liters per hour for a running main engine, and the math is overwhelming. Roughly 1/10 the fuel cost for the same result. There is no separate engine vibrating under the cab, no rumble, no exhaust noise beyond a quiet hum. Just a trickle of diesel and a small electrical draw from the truck's batteries to keep the fan and fuel pump going. In Scandinavia, where winter temperatures stay well below -20 Celsius for months, these parking heaters are not considered optional equipment. Volvo and Scania trucks built for northern European markets roll off the assembly line with them already installed. The alternative, tens of thousands of truck drivers idling their main engines all night across the highways of Norway, Sweden, and Finland, is both expensive and in many areas flat out illegal. In practice, a driver with a Webasto or Espar unit sets the thermostat to his preferred temperature before climbing into the bunk. The heater cycles on and off through the night, maintaining a steady cabin temperature while burning almost nothing. Some units even have programmable timers that let the driver set the heater to kick on an hour before his alarm goes off, so the cab is already warm when he wakes up to start driving. For a driver whose sleeper cab is his home, that kind of detail makes the difference between just surviving the winter and actually living through it comfortably. If you want to know what actually happens when all of this technology fails at 3 in the morning with no help coming, subscribe. That is exactly the kind of thing we break down on this channel every week. So the engineering handles the basics. But the reality of living in a sleeper cab through -30 winters is about more than just what equipment the truck comes with. It is about the routines, the habits, and the personal gear that experienced drivers build up over years of calling a metal box home in the coldest places on the continent. This is the part where a sleeper cab stops being a truck feature and starts becoming an actual apartment. A driver who lives in his sleeper cab full-time and regularly runs routes through northern Canada or the upper Midwest does not just throw a thin blanket on the bunk and call it a night. That is a mistake you make exactly once during your first real January on the road. By February, you have a sleeping bag rated to -30. Walk into the sleeper cab of a driver who has been doing this for 5 or 10 years, and you will see something that looks less like a truck and more like a tiny studio apartment. A microwave mounted on a shelf for hot meals, A small 12-volt refrigerator humming next to the bunk, a television or tablet set up for movies and shows during downtime, curtains pulled across the gap between the driver's seat and the sleeper to create a separate room, personal touches everywhere, photos taped to the wall, a coffee maker plugged into the inverter, maybe a small rug on the floor to keep feet off cold metal. These drivers have turned survival into something closer to comfort through years of trial and error. Experienced cold weather drivers invest in serious sleeping gear. Heavy-duty sleeping bags rated to -20 or -30 Celsius become primary bedding, not emergency backup. Thermal blankets, layered bedding systems, and insulated mattress pads turn the bunk into something that would keep you warm for hours even if every heating system in the truck shut off at once. The bunk stops being a feature on a spec sheet and becomes an actual bedroom. Layered with thought, built for the worst case, and set up with the same care you would give your bed at home. A lot of drivers running remote routes through the Canadian prairies or the upper Midwest also keep an emergency thermal bivy stashed in their cab as a last resort. Something like a TerraShell, a compact reflective sleeping bag that traps your own body heat without needing any power source. You toss it in the glove box or the side pocket of your bunk and forget about it until the night your APU quits at 3 in the morning in Saskatchewan. The aluminized lining reflects body heat back, blocks wind and moisture, and buys you critical hours. Drivers who have lived through a real heating failure will tell you that having something like that is not paranoia, it is common sense. Link in the description. Clothing matters too. Nobody who has been through a few winters sleeps in shorts and a t-shirt in January in northern Manitoba. Thermal base layers, wool socks, and a light beanie are normal sleeping attire for a cold weather driver. Nobody looks glamorous, everybody stays warm. Preheating the cab is another veteran move. Start either. Every experienced cold climate driver knows about this problem. They switch to winter blend diesel as soon as temperatures start dropping, or they add anti-gel additives to their fuel tanks throughout the cold months. Running a parking heater on gelled fuel is a guaranteed way to wake up freezing in a truck that refuses to cooperate, and this is the part where things get serious. Everything we have talked about so far, the insulation, the parking heaters, the APUs, the sleeping gear, the preheating routines, all of it exists because getting cold weather sleeping wrong in a truck is not just uncomfortable. It can kill you. The most immediate danger is hypothermia. If a driver's primary heat source fails in the middle of the night and they do not have adequate backup gear, the temperature inside that cab will drop steadily toward the outside temperature. Hypothermia can begin at body temperatures that do not sound all that extreme, especially if the driver is exhausted from a full day behind the wheel, dehydrated, or wearing the wrong clothing to bed. In a metal cab with -30 outside and no heat running, the window between cold but manageable and dangerously hypothermic can close in just a few hours. For someone whose truck is their home, there is no warm building to walk to. The truck is the building, but there is a second danger that does not get enough attention, and it has killed drivers who thought they were being careful. Carbon monoxide poisoning. A driver who decides to leave the main engine idling all night for warmth, especially during a heavy snowfall where drifts can build up around the truck and block the exhaust pipe, risks carbon monoxide accumulating inside the cab. Carbon monoxide has no color and no smell. You cannot detect it without equipment. A lot of experienced drivers keep a battery-powered carbon monoxide detector mounted in their sleeper for exactly this reason. It is cheap, small, easy to install, and there are drivers alive today because theirs went off in the middle of the night. And then there is the mechanical nightmare, the scenario that every cold weather driver carries in the back of their mind. Truck batteries lose a significant portion of their capacity in extreme cold. A battery that turns the engine over with no hesitation at 50 degrees Fahrenheit might barely crank the starter at -30. Many cold climate drivers use battery blankets and engine block heaters, small devices that plug into shore power at a truck stop and keep the engine block and battery warm overnight. The goal is avoiding one very specific situation: dead truck, -30, a remote highway in northern Ontario or the Yukon, no cell service, nobody driving past until a snowplow shows up 8 hours later. That is the scenario that turns every piece of preparation, from the sleeping bag to the block heater to the TerraShell stashed in the glove box, from a nice-to-have into survival equipment. Because when your home is a 70-square-foot metal box and the temperature outside is cold enough to kill you, there is no such thing as over-prepared. Drivers who have been through a real heating failure at -30 will tell you the same thing. The first thing you do is stay calm. You put on every layer you have. You climb into your sleeping bag. If you have an emergency bivy, you get inside it. You cover your head. And you wait. You wait for daylight, or for another truck to pull over, or for your battery to recover enough charge to crank the engine. Panicking burns energy and body heat. Staying still and staying covered buys you hours. That is the knowledge that comes from living on the road through enough winters to know what cold actually means. There is one more piece to this that ties the whole story together. The anti-idling laws we talked about earlier, the regulations that limit how long a truck engine can run while parked, frustrated a lot of drivers when they first went into effect across North America. Nobody wants to be told they cannot keep their own heat running. But those regulations pushed the entire industry toward adopting auxiliary power units and diesel parking heaters on a scale that might never have happened otherwise. And the technology that replaced idling turned out to be cheaper, quieter, more fuel efficient, and safer than what it replaced. The trucking industry runs on patterns like this: a problem nobody wants to deal with, a regulation that forces a response, and a solution that ends up better than what existed before. The drivers who have been on the road long enough tend to recognize the pattern even when a new rule makes them grind their teeth. So the next time you drive past a row of dark semi-trucks parked along a frozen highway at 2 in the morning, engines off, headlights dark, snow blowing across the lot, you will know what is happening inside those sleeper cabs. Insulated walls holding heat, a Webasto parking heater burning a trickle of diesel through the night, a driver sleeping warm under a -30 rated sleeping bag in the most thermally protected corner of a 70-square-foot apartment on 18 wheels. Comfortable in conditions that would be dangerous for anyone who was not prepared. Subscribe if you want more like this. We cover the engineering and the hidden stories behind the trucking industry every week.